Welcome, everyone. It's Angelo Robles, and welcome to my Family Office TV. We have a really special program for you today, 2024 Family Office Trends. And do I have a special guest for you? At this stage, he probably even needs no introduction. And that would be, but he's going to get one anyway, and that would be the one and the only Ron Diamond. So, Ron is a longtime investor and entrepreneur. Ron is the founder and chairman of Diamond Wealth. He represents over 100 family offices ranging in size from $250 million to $30 billion. Ron is helping to launch the Family Office Initiative at the University of Chicago, Booth School of Business. He serves on the advisory board of 10 privately held companies and acts as the chairman of 4 of them. Ron is also the chair of 2 Tiger 21 chapters in Chicago and chairs a newly created family office group for Tiger 21. He's been a longtime friend. Ron Diamond, welcome to my show.
Angelo, it's been great to see, always great to see you.
And I haven't seen you in person in a while, but because we're friends, we've kept in touch, including Zooms and the like over the years. So one, I do have to just give people a little bit of context. I feel like I've known Ron, which I guess I have for such a long, long time. I may be a year off, but I believe, Ron is an accomplished hedge fund manager. His background's very accomplished as an investor, a mutual friend in Silicon Valley, 3,000 miles away from my home. I was hosting an event. I believe it was January of 2017. And he goes, I have this guy. He's amazing. You have to meet him. Could I bring him to the event? His name is Ron Diamond, and I love the name Diamond. So, I'm already in. I got to meet this guy. He sounds like he's awesome. And I met Ron. Not only was he quite the gentleman, not only did he probably ask the best questions of the day, but what do you expect from Ron Diamond? We got a chance to know one another, and I seen him just flourish. Like when I think of who is a thought leader who creates original thoughts, which are very, very few people in this community, among the first names I think of is Ron Diamond. And many of you have said, Angelo, you and Ron are both bigger than life personalities. You agree on some things, disagree on others. You haven't ever had them on your platforms, whether podcast, Family Office TV. Well, we changed that, and we're changing that today. Ron, it's so great to see you.
Great to be with you, Angelo.
So, audience, this is actually live. If you're quote unquote a live audience, we do encourage you to quote unquote ask questions through any sort of chat feature or DM. On that note, Ron, why don't we get started? So, I think we both have said something to the effect of 2/3 of single family offices have been created really in this century since 2000. Now, okay, you could say '01, you could say '08, you could say COVID. I'm not saying it's all been a smooth ride, but for the most part, these young ones, or young in terms of great wealth in a family office, they know nothing but effectively artificially very low interest rates, a highly favorable environment for investing, broadly speaking. And what happens when turbulent times and challenging times? Do you think this is going to cause a lot of stress for families and their family offices?
Yes, absolutely. So it's interesting because, as you alluded to, 68% of family offices that existed, there's roughly 15,000 family offices. 68% were created since 2000 and half since the crash. And what happened is and having said that, the model itself for family offices, and it gets thrown around all the time, the model doesn't really work. Only 25% of families make it to the second gen, 10 make it to the third, and 5 make it to the fourth. So all of these people who've come into a huge amount of wealth in a relatively short period of time are trying to get into an area that the model as it is structured really doesn't work. And what happened was post-crash, pre-COVID, when interest rates were zero, I don't care what you invested in, you made money. Private equity, venture capital, real estate, credit, Bitcoin, the stock market, whatever you invested in went up.
I felt like a genius, Ron.
Well, a lot of people did. And so what happened is a lot of the family offices then started to do direct deal. They started to invest directly. And the thought process was, why should I pay an expert? I used to run a hedge fund. Why should I pay you or a private equity guy or a real estate guy 2 and 20 if I'm making money and can do it myself? And that logic, which was myopic, it worked until it didn't. And what we saw happening, as you alluded to, about 18 months ago, as they started raising interest rates, um, a lot of these family offices are not only not making money, they're losing money, particularly in venture, real estate, and they're in way over their skis. So just because you can create Beanie Babies and sell it for a couple $1 billion doesn't mean you're qualified to buy hotels. And we kind of saw how that played out. So I think you've got huge amounts of money in very inefficient hands in general. I would say 75% of the family offices that exist today shouldn't exist as they're structured currently. And I think you're going to see a lot of change. And I think over the next 3 to 5 years, people who are looking to raise money from family offices are going to have a lot more success because the family office are going to realize they're not great at everything. They might have created a great company and sold it for a lot of money, but that doesn't make you good at investing.
Ron, you probably gave me about 10 questions to follow up on, but we're going to weave them through the approximate 50 minutes that we have remaining. But staying perhaps a little bit on that theme of their only use of comfort for the biggest degree, how do you feel in your experience dealing with what I define as elders? Do they really feel that they're younger millennial and Gen Z, their rising generation that know nothing but what I would broadly define as good times? Are they really ready?
In general, the answer is no. I mean, some are if they've gone to school for it. I mean, part of the problem is that, you know, you want to rate. I have two beautiful daughters, Zoe and Bella. Zoe's 23 and Bella's 20. I want to raise them with a mindset of gratitude. To raise with a mindset of entitlement would be the worst failure I could have as a parent. And I think a lot of parents, while they're well intentioned, um, our generation doesn't the new generation doesn't have grit, and our generation doesn't let them fail, and I think that's a disservice for them. So I think in general, there's a disconnect. While I think I'm going to start with the premise that people are always well or mostly well intentioned, I think the consequences are often bad, and that's a result of, again, just giving and giving and giving and not letting people fall down and make mistakes by themselves.
Completely agree. And I think that's going to be a great challenge. And many of the challenges that you noted that you see moving forward, we're pretty much effectively on the same page. And as I said, we'll dive into some of them shortly. Audiences love to hear what I would call our lessons learned. So I'll give you one from my perspective. What I learned from close alignment and being in the trenches with two very prominent Forbes 50 families and helping to reconfigure their SFOs and seeing how they operate. There was so much for me to learn, specifically from the principal. So they focused on identifying and executing on the right opportunity. And that is more important than wasting time, energy, and resources on what I would define as mediocre, let alone bad, even mediocre. They're able to be very choice selective on what is going to be the best optimization of their time and, rather bluntly, their capital. What would be a lesson in your deep experiences? We're relatively in the same, well, we are in the same age bracket. What is a lesson that you've learned from successful families?
It's a great question. I think that you have to be intentional, right? I mean, a lot of us we're on a treadmill, and the world goes by very, very quickly. And what we need to do as a society, I think, is kind of take a step back. And one of the lessons that I learned, and again, I look at the world through a different lens today than I did when I was 25 and just getting started out in my career. Um, I, I think that um, family families who created an inordinate amount of wealth, um, it's terrific, but you have to have an understanding and what is it for and what are the values. I mean, the pharaohs tried to bury themselves with their money. That didn't work out too well. So, what are you going to do with it? What's the legacy? And I think a lot of it has to do with intentionality and raising kids and having family values, and that's why everything's got it passed down.
I think that's excellent. Actually, glad Ron, I'm so glad to hear you talk about several times morals, values, character. Really, the number one responsibility for a parent, whether rich or poor, But being rich, you can't outsource spending time with your children, your grandchildren, your family, instilling values, teaching family history, and effectively what we broadly define as character. If your rising generation lacks in character, there is no way that they're going to be a substantial family longer term moving forward. And are you going to be proud of that, even short term, if they are? So, taking the responsibility that you cannot outsource to a private school or your family office. I don't care if you're worth 100 billion, it's your responsibility for your family. Uh, Related to what I said about lessons learned, uh, I do believe, and we probably have both met geniuses before. I mean, I might have met one the day that I met this Mr. Diamond guy like 6 years ago. But a genius intellect can be wasted, back to what I said about the right opportunity, on the wrong opportunity. Isn't part of genius optimization focusing on the right opportunity and even partner in business and life selection? How important is that?
Well, it's a great point. I mean, relationships, my whole world is built as is yours, and you've done a tremendous job and you've got a great reputation of building relationships. That's what life's all about, in business and in anything. And so I think that you see a lot of these people are trying to get there very, very quickly and not really focus on long-term relationships. Um, People take shortcuts, I think, in general. And I think that what we need to do, what people need to do, and the families that are successful at this, they instill in their kids that you're not, because your grandpa built this huge company, you're not entitled to come in. I mean, what I would do is just say you've got to work somewhere else for 5 years or 10 years and kind of get your feet wet and understand what it's like. Because if you pick up the phone and your calling is third generation of this huge family office, everybody's going to take your call, but you're not going to know what it's like to make a phone call and get hung up on or have people. So I think there's a learning process, and I think that that's something that's incumbent upon the families to do.
Ron, there's a theme that you were years ahead of the community. Even I consider myself pretty good at being futuresque and creative in my thinking, but audiences love stories, right? So it's August of 2019. I'm in Santa Monica. You're in Santa Monica. That's because I hosted probably the biggest event per volume of people that I ever did, with a draw, and of course, Mr. Diamond as well. But one of the other draws being a very large man named Tony Robbins. So being on stage with Tony for near 2 hours was interesting, intimidating, and a great experience. But I never forgot, you spoke and you only had like 10, 15 minutes. You were wickedly concise. You were very on time. And this goes back 5 years ago. And you were pounding back then before everyone else that family offices have the potential to displace to a degree opportunity investing in private companies that are now the domain of private equity or venture capital or collective other syndicates and institutions. That family offices can make an impact, especially if they band together, because they're going to be patient capital. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, look, in the mid 80s, when I graduated college, private equity, I used to run a hedge fund. So if you're running a company and you've got to report to me or an analyst on Wall Street every 90 days, it's a very hard way to run your company. You have to run, it's myopic, and you can't make the long-term bets. So private equity and venture capital in the mid 80s really took off because it was a better model. And the model also was 2% covers the overhead, 20% you only make money if I make money. So interests were aligned and they didn't have the 90-day time constraint. The problem in general, and again, I'm generalizing because there's a lot of great private equity firms, but I think that many of the private equity firms have bastardized the business and it's become an AUM game. And, just a quick example, I had a friend who did a roll up of logistics companies and he needed $150 million. Placement agent got him 500. He said he just needed 150 to get started. The placement agent actually came to his house in New York and wrote down 2% of 500 million equals X, 2% of 150 equals Y. What am I missing? And my friend, who was a bit incredulous, kind of scratched his head and said, what you're missing is if I do what you want me to do, there won't be a fund two because I can't deploy the other 350.
Hmm.
That's a microcosm of what's wrong with the industry. So family offices, it is a superior model. Having said that, we're not there yet. We're only in the second or third inning. So you've got family offices like the Paul Carbone's a good friend. So the Pritzkers, the Dells, Sergey Brin's family office, the Crowns, they've institutionalized this, right? They've got a team of 50, 60 people. They can compete directly with Carlisle and Blackstone and KKR. In most instances, in many instances, they could beat them because it's a better model. It's patient capital. And what patient capital, the main thing with that is, and that's going to be a term more and more people will learn about, private equity and venture capital, they're incented to flip companies every 3 to 5 years. That's not bad. It's just the way it is. It's the model. That's how their partners are paid. So if you look at a company that was a private equity firm that purchases a family-owned business and they buy it and they hold it for 3 to 4 years and then they sell it, oftentimes it's the private equity firm too. And they'll hold it for 3, 4, 5 years, hopefully make money on it and sell it to private equity firm 3. So over the course of a 20-year period, you could see a company change hands 4 to 5 times. And if you look at the taxes and the disruption in the business and the inefficiencies of doing that versus simply compounding and buying a company like a family office can do and holding it for 20 years, it's not even close, the results. So that's patient capital, and that's why it's so valuable.
Very well said. And to anyone who says otherwise, they're full of it. I was there early back in 19, meaning 2019, when Ron was talking about this years ago before everyone else. He was ahead of the curve. And I remember that you got such, other than Tony, because Tony's Tony, you were the highest rated speaker ahead of Supermodel. How did you do this, Ron? Ahead of Supermodel. That was a great day for me. I had Ron Diamond, Tony Robbins, and he was ahead in the ratings of Supermodel Kathy Ireland. I don't know how you did it.
Well, I don't think I would have rated me ahead of her, but it was a
I'm not
wonderful.
saying that I did, Ron, but I'm just saying the audience is the audience. The audience is the one that makes the decisions, what they like and what they don't like. Now, relative to what you just said, would you say, and I'm in the backyard of Greater Greenwich, Connecticut, of hedge funds, do some of the hedge funds, venture capital, private equity, giant real estate funds, exactly that word giant, do they become so big that they become asset gatherers?
Yeah, absolutely. It becomes an AUM game. I mean, look, if you think about it, let's start with the premise that the founder of a hedge fund or private equity or real estate company is trying to make a lot of money. Let's just start with that premise. If you could run a $300 million fund and you're making 2% of that, that's a really good annuity. But if you could take that 300 million and raise $3 billion, you're basically taking 2% of $3 billion, and that's an annuity every single year. So that's good short term, but it's not necessarily good for the investors because it forces you to make decisions that aren't necessarily in the best long-term interest. Because at the end of the day, if you raised a $5 billion fund for a private equity fund, you have two options. You could deploy it or you can give it back. I've never seen ever in my 30 years people giving it back. So they're going to deploy it. And what happened is there was a period where we would, I've got a syndicate of 100 families that we invest alongside. We saw some great deals that we were going to buy, and we thought it was worth X. And then a private equity firm comes and pays 2X or 3X for it. We would say, fine. And they had to overpay for it because they had to deploy the capital. So I think the model itself is flawed. Having said that, we're not there yet. Family offices today, when I did a podcast with Tony Pritzker, and what he said is he wouldn't even call what he has as a family office because the term family office implies that something's whimsical and something's not that sophisticated. So he called it family capital, and he was very strict about that. And I think that in general, most of the family offices are not structured today where they can compete directly with the private equity or venture capital or real estate firms. I think that's going to change. And I think over the next 3 to 5 years, you'll see it more of the family offices band together. I think family offices are very fragmented, very siloed, and very inefficient. I think that's starting to change.
Okay, now we're kind of rolling up our sleeves. Do you believe there's too many family offices?
Well, it's a great question. So the short answer is yes. Secondly, I make no judgments. If anybody sold a widget company or they did anything to make money, I don't judge them. They could do whatever they want. So you sell a company for 30 million or 50 or $100 million. That's a tremendous amount of money. It's just not enough money to have a family office. In order for it to make economic sense to have a family office, and I'm not going to do it now, but you could reverse engineer it. You need about $250 million if you're going to invest in private markets like private equity and venture capital
At
investment.
least. Right.
And there are a lot of people who call themselves family offices. And again, I make no judgment. You can call yourself whatever you want. But if you're under 250, that's why multifamily offices were created, right? So rather than paying for your own accountant, your own lawyer, your own admin, your own people, you split the cost with 10, 20, 30, 50 families. That's what multifamily offices are. And I think the problem with single family offices, a lot of this is ego driven. And the problem with many of the family offices, the biggest obstacle, in my opinion, is that they have it's the ego of the matriarch or patriarch, because at the end of the day, you could be really good at something. I'm really good at certain things, and I'm really bad at certain things. All I do is surround myself with people that are smarter than me, and delegate. And I think the family offices, the people who've made all this money, in general, I think ego distracts from what they're really trying to do.
Okay, let's do another deeper dive into effectively that question. So, if they need to have a quarter of a billion, and if they're going to be active direct investing and want to attract top talent, so I added a very important element there. We're probably talking that a quarter of a billion might even be laughable. So now, if they're looking to attract top talent, how are they going to do so? Uh, I wrote about years ago about how Sid Bass recruited the 26-year-old Richard Rainwater away from Goldman into his family office, instantly structured co-investment and carry opportunities. And we all know that Richard Rainwater became a Forbes 400, a legendary investor, and Sid Bass was brilliant for plucking him and giving him the opportunity. We all know about, what was it, John and Glenn at MSD back in the day, about 21, 22 years ago. They both walked away with, I'm assuming, hundreds of millions of dollars. And that becomes kind of the holy grail for the executive that is somewhat investing centric. But that's very, very rarefied air. Very, very few principals and family offices want to build that kind of company and have the resources to. How are they going to compete with the Blackstones, with private equity, if they're not paying very handsomely?
Great question. So Trish Botoff, who's a friend, and I know you know her, puts together a wonderful compensation report. But when I talked to Tony Pritzker, and he brought on Paul Carbone, who's become a good friend. Here's what he said. He goes, I Paul said this initially, and then Tony kind of agreed with it. He's not going to. Paul was very successful, very smart, and he was working at Baird, a very successful venture private equity firm. In order to attract the talent of Paul, you have to incent them. You have to give them part of the carry. You have to give them forgivable loans or lines of credit or ways for them to invest with it. And in general, the difference between family offices the way they are today, and I think they will be in 10 years, if a family office hires somebody out of Stanford or Harvard and they pay them $250,000 a year, most of them, not all, but most, look at that as a cost. In other words, that cost me 250. The people who are thinking about it more thoughtfully, like, and if you look at private equity like Blackstone or KKR, they look at the $250,000 as a potential $20 million profit center. So it's not a cost, it's a potential profit center. It's nuanced, but looking at it through that lens. So I think the lens that a lot of the family offices today look at is they want to do it as inexpensive as they can, but that's backward logic, and they're not going to be able to attract the top talent. Tony Pritzker understands this better than anybody in the country, I think, and what he's created with Paul. And they pay, but they incent these people. That's what has to happen. And most family offices don't fully understand that. They will, but they don't yet.
I completely agree 100%. Now, what we may go a little back and forth on, you're correct. If you have the wealth and you want privacy control and customization, in theory, the SFO could be the ultimate. But too many, Ron, I mean, let's just be honest, too many people in our community try to play it safe and be vanilla. You and I tend to push boundaries a little bit. Although it's not mathematically an accurate comment, but most family offices are mediocre. They're trustworthy, and I feel that they're doing to some degree a good enough job. But why have a single family office which takes time, energy, and resources? Three of Angelo's favorite words. When you're not going to want to have it be great. You built a great company, or your heirs did. You should have pride in your legacy and your capital moving forward. You might have enough resources for 1,000 years, yet somehow it often seems to fall apart. Now, yeah, part of that's lack of governance and family dynamics, but there's the family office should be helping to procure positive future outcomes and family continuity. Ron, let's just be honest, it falls short a lot.
I would say it's less than mediocre. And again, I would
Worse
say
than me.
look, objectively, most of the family offices, the way they're run, they shouldn't exist. In my opinion, they can exist, but they need to be changed in how they're structured. The model just doesn't really work. And again, it goes back to ego. You sell your company. It's like right now. Um, I just think that a lot of people they sell their company. What are they? I want to have a family office. Well, a family office could be you sell your company for $500 million and then you hire your son-in-law to run the private markets because he graduated with straight A's from Indiana University. And that's a family office. And then the Pritzkers, who've got a team of 65 people who analyze every single deal, and they segregate into venture capital and private equity and real estate in different areas like that. So I think that the term family office it's just thrown around so much, and the way most of them are structured, they shouldn't be. The way that Tony Pritzker and Paul Carbone structure this, that's the ideal. So what we're doing, we're in it'll be announced publicly in the next 60 days, but we're in the process of creating a family office initiative. I created one at Stanford, and I'm in the process of creating one or helping to create one at University of Chicago, where basically you can learn best practices because at the end of the day, families are very siloed. So just because you've made a lot of money in real estate doesn't mean if this real estate guy says he's investing in this tech guy and because he's made a lot of money, you should invest in the investment in technology. It makes no sense.
Yeah, I mean, we're actually agreeing too much, Ron. We have to find some things we have a bit of a disagreement on. I'm sure there's going to be some, but give us a little insight. So Pritzker's an iconic person, Carbone, who I met a couple of times, great guy and very effective. What does it take? Like, so Carbone must have built a team. There's analysts. If you could give our audience in 2 or 3 minutes, so now they know what it takes and maybe how much money it costs to do it right, like, what kind of team does Carbone have under him?
An incredible team, a world class team that would equal any private equity firm would equal, and I would say in many instances superior to a Blackstone or a Carlyle. So not only does Tony have to pay Paul, but Paul has to incent his people, and then his people have to incent their people. So they understand it. And a lot of people look at this as a zero-sum game that you have a finite amount of money. If you look at the fact, if you look at the world that it's a grow that with a growth mindset, which is kind of how I look at it, I'd rather make a whole bunch of people really, really wealthy, right? And yet the mindset of many people who are much more myopic is they think there's a finite amount of capital they have and they're trying to hold on to it as much as possible. So I think that you're going to see some massive changes in the next 3 to 5 years, massive. And I do believe that as private equity and venture capital disrupted the public markets, family offices will disrupt the private equity and venture. They'll never replace them, but they will disrupt them because it is a better model if executed properly with the right foundation.
And you gave great example why, if nothing else, patient capital. They don't need to deploy, they don't need to overpay. And in theory, I mean, I had one family tell me, Angelo, we don't co-invest with another family until we know them a while. And I'm like, well, I don't know, like a month, a year, 2 years. And this was an old guard, waspy, seven generation family. About three generations. I'm like, okay.
Well, but it is it's a really good point because, what's interesting is,
Trust.
a lot of people who are looking to raise money from I mean, that's where the money is. So, you've got $10 trillion in capital, but you've got 84.4 trillion that's coming downstream from the next 20 years. So it's the largest transfer of wealth ever. So every bank, law firm, accounting firm, they're all trying to get into the market because that's where all the money is. But I think if you look at it from the perspective of, how does this work and how should it work? A lot of family offices right now, th- they look at the world. They're going to become more institutionalized, and they're not yet, but they're going to become more institutionalized. And once they institutionalize themselves, that's when they could use the what I'll call private patient capital and take advantage of that. Most of them don't right now. So what I'm talking about, in theory, I'm correct. In reality, it's incorrect today for most family offices to compete with these firms. It will change. It cannot not change because that's just basically how it's the lowest common denominator. That's how it will end up. It's just a question of will it be 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years.
And back a little bit to the Pritzker Carbone, approximately under poll, like is it 3 people, 10 people, 12 people?
No,
More than that?
he's got a team of 65 people.
So we're talking about tens of millions in salary, let alone bonuses and carry.
Right, and I know I can't say publicly, but I know what their IR. I know what they've done, and they've done phenomenally well. And I know other family offices have done the same. Um, IRR is a moot point for a family office. They don't have to worry about.
Exactly.
They don't have to worry about how everything looks. They just look at everything compounding, and if they look at it through the long term time perspective, that's really what they have going for them. It's the patient capital and the fact that they're not incented to flip.
And the audience has been pretty active with questions. I do appreciate it. I promise I will get to each one with Ron, so I am not ignoring you or forgotten. And I think being immersive and interactive, I do appreciate that as part of a live audience today. Uh, Of course, Family Office TV is my more media and public facing arm, and I do enjoy quote unquote family office media, but my bread and butter is the work that I do with an intimate group of up to 30 families called SFO Continuity, and my educational platforms through my Family Office Masterclass, which both of them effectively funnel into per my selection consulting. So there's a couple of truths, Ron, and I probably call it a little bit of an Angeloism that I've learned. Bad family offices, they want to be left alone. Good ones want to be mentored. Great ones want to be told the truth. How many family offices you know where they identify their blind spots, they move their ego aside, even if it's a multi-billionaire, and they're willing to be told the truth. They desire to be told the truth, at least for the perspective of the person, quote unquote, telling the truth, so they could have honest feedback. They could adapt. They could make better decisions.
A handful, tops.
Yeah, yeah, that's about right. uh, on the direction of what we're talking about and what you're saying. So, a survey of North American family offices conducted by Camden and RBC found that family offices had about 29.2% of their investments in the private markets and 28.5 in the public markets. This is the first time since they've been doing that there's more capital in quote unquote private markets than public markets. Do you think that trend will continue?
Absolutely. I mean, it's going to continue. Private markets will continue to go up. Public markets will continue to go down. A lot of the reason is a lot of these companies are staying private longer. So the alpha that's created when a company goes public happens when they're private rather than they go public. And then a lot of people are also realizing that being public, it's not such, it's not. I was on the other side, right? So it's not great to be a publicly traded company, in my opinion, because literally you're managing your earnings. You have to take into consideration that Wall Street's watching you. So I think that the private equity has done extraordinarily well over the last 20 years. Um, and I think it can continue to do well. I think that more and more family offices are going to look at this through the lens of there's 29%, it's going to go to 30%, it'll go to 32%. The private markets, I just have money in index funds, and I made my money in the public markets when I ran a hedge fund. But it's very difficult to create alpha, in my opinion, and I'm right, in the public markets. I just have money in index funds. In the private markets, to create alpha, private equity, venture capital, real estate credit, you can. And the difference also is that in order to the advantage that family offices have over these private equity and venture capital firms, in order to create alpha, you really have to operate a company, right? If you look at most of these private equity and venture capital firms, and I don't mean to pick on them, well, I kind of don't need to pick on them, but basically, they're a lot of finance guys, and there's nothing wrong with that. But
Right.
I could financial engineer most companies and strip it and make money. But in order to truly create alpha over the long term, you have to operate. And family offices are operators in general, almost always. And private equity and venture capital firms look at things much more, not always, through a financial engineering standpoint.
Excellent. And in terms of with your experience knowing so many family offices and syndicates and seeing the good, the bad, and the ugly, given that we are in turbulent times, unique times, uh, and ownership of direct assets or quote unquote non-public companies, what kind of verticals are you seeing? Forget about trendy. Real estate's probably the most consistent. Obviously, CRE, commercial real estate, office has been hit very hard since COVID. A lot of people are over levered. You have quote unquote rising interest rates. But what other verticals, infrastructure, energy, what are you seeing the family showing where they can make an impact and they're going to have patient capital?
Well, private credit's been a huge growth area for
Yeah.
family offices. There's firms like Blue Owl who they spun together it was part of Owl Rock, and they spun together three companies. But I think private credit is something that has done very, very well and will continue to do very, very well. They're basically taking less risk and getting better returns. So they're fairly consistently making 8 to 10%. Now, with private credit, what's happening is um, if you're a pension, it's great. If you're an individual, after taxes, it's not as attractive. But there's something called PPLI, which is private placement life insurance, which you can create, which basically creates like a 50 bip drag on the return in order to not pay taxes. So now that's very attractive. I think real estate will always be attractive for family offices because that's where many of them made their money. I think private equity will always be attractive. I think venture capital, Carter did a study where the average Series B investment was down 50% at one point, and the average Series C was down 75%. And a lot of these families did direct deals. Venture, unless you do venture 100% of the time, or you made your money in venture, you shouldn't do it. That should be outsourced, and I think that will be. But private equity and real estate and credit are mainstays for the families.
Let's talk a little bit about family offices. And when I was reading your bio, you're very involved on the board and the chair of certain boards. So you understand the value in at least the right community. No person, in my opinion, is on an island. The greatest, LeBron James, Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, all since a young age have coaches. The president has a cabinet. You can't buy love, but you can buy wisdom. You can use money to buy wisdom. How important is it for a single family office, again, identifying blind spots and moving ego aside, that they should build a great board and knowing that they're going to have to compensate people if the people are really, really good? And this goes back to our family offices, penny wise and pound foolish. Do they have the right eyeballs? And if they could buy wisdom, why aren't they?
Well, remember, a lot of times people have made a tremendous amount of money in a company and sold it, and they have a liquidity event, and now they're going to open a family office. And if you're going to create a family office, it's a full-time job if you're going to do it right. And I think many of these people think, well, I've already made a ton of money, I'll have a family office, and they don't look at it and run it as efficiently as they did their office, their regular business. And I think that's part of the problem. So people, I think, don't fully understand in order to create an efficient family office, it is a full-time job. And I would argue that very few people, very few of these family offices put as much emphasis in time on the family office as they did the business where they made their money.
100%. And we're going to go to audience questions in about probably 4 to 5 more minutes. So just be a little patient. I would say, with my 2 decades in the community and my love and focus on the single family office community and knowing thousands, I have been very lucky and very fortunate. My main focus, and maybe where we're a little different, you're wonderful in what you do and on investments. I kind of like the work of a Peter Drucker and Jim Collins, consultative practice management. I know it's boring to a lot of people, but hey, that gives me a little competition, and that's where I kind of thrive. I actually do believe, and it's going to sound a little arrogant to the audience, I don't mean it this way, that I could go into any family office where give me people that are at least competent in terms of their IQ and they're willing to listen and put in the work. You absolutely could go from mediocrity to good. Going from good to great, that 10% difference, as Collins talks about, Jim Collins, that's very hard, although potentially that is possible. But certain things that I have learned, often the family office, they don't really have a how problem. They have a who problem. Now that puts the burden on the people, but people are the number one resource in the family office. But if they had identifying blind spots, moving ego aside, they build up mentors, they have a board, they're willing to have people tell them the truth, they could identify these things. So what do you think about you don't really have a how problem, you really have a who problem. Incredibly intelligent minds that are open-minded, they figure out solutions.
Well, I think it's a good point. You have a who problem, but I think even more important than that, you really have a why problem. So, like, why are you creating the family office? And again, I keynoted an event at Stanford 5 years ago, and I had five multi-billion-dollar families that I was working with, and I asked each one of them, "What is a family office, and why did you create it?" And I had five completely different answers. And nobody was wrong and nobody was right. It's just where we are. So I think that the who is important, but I think the why is really important. And if you're going to spend your time on this and run it like a business, which you have to in order to be efficient, you have to understand it's because you want to have the family generation, go down 3, 4, 5, 10 generations. You're looking to do that. You want to have certain values. There's philanthropic activities that are very important. If you don't understand the why, and you just have a lot of money, so you just say, well, I've got $500 million or $1 billion. Now I should have a family office. It doesn't, that's not a good reason.
I agree. Maybe my variation of what you say is why is you need to focus on, and I kind of hinted at it when I said what I learned from the two Forbes 50 families earlier, on identifying the right problems or opportunities that are more impactful than finding solutions to existing problems. If all you're doing is solving fires that happen every day, and someone has to do it, I get it, it's important, but that's not long term, that's not strategic, that's not identifying the right problems. Like I said, I actually, although it sounds like I'm crushing SFOs for being mediocrity, I actually think they have something in them to be much better than they are. Are you going to wave a magic wand and turn them into Carbone or a direct investing team? No. But could you make them much more effective than they are now, even if it's more as an outsource on the investing end, if they're just willing? And I'm not even saying it has to be me, although I'm pretty good. But yourself, Ron, and others, if they accept mentorship, accept coaching, and have the resources to pay for it, Lord knows they have it. It's whether they want to. In other words, I think what I'm trying to say, Ron, do you think most family offices rest on their laurels? The spotlight is not being shined on them. They're not going to steal. This is the final position in their career, and they're kind of playing it safe.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some truth to that. I think what you do is, and you do it probably better, I would argue, than anyone in the country,
Oh,
is
thank you.
it's the soft skills that are really important, the most important thing. I mean, what happens is people have a liquidity event. They sell their company, for a cannabis company, for $1 billion, or a real estate company. What's the first thing they do? they invest. They want to invest in a great private equity deal or direct deal that their friend's doing, or somebody at the country club. What's the first thing they should do? Talk to an estate planning attorney. That's kind of like the structure of a house. So without the proper foundation, part of the reason that you can really create tax alpha. Your estate planning attorney for these family offices is more important than your private equity guy or your venture capital guy, because without the proper structure, it'll fall apart. So I think they have to look at things and from a long-term perspective and understand it. And a lot of the times people have sold their companies, they'll sell their company and they'll say, I want to do estate planning now. And they'll come to me and say, well, you could do about 10%, because if you do the planning before you sign up LOI, letter of intent, you
Mhm.
can get a lot of things out of your estate. You can do discount valuation. That's what these trust and estate planning attorneys do. So when I ran my hedge fund, I had one of the top estate planning attorneys who was in the office of the patriarch of the guy who was very, very wealthy. But the estate planning attorney had no clue what I was talking about as far as the strategy. And I asked him why he was in the room. And then I was 32 and he kind of patted me on the back. He said, the goal is not to be a billionaire. The goal is to be worth zero, but control as much as you can. And that's all trust and estate planning attorneys do. And they want to be asset protected. So it's really, you have to really think this thing through. But if you do and you listen and you learn, and that's one of the things we're trying to create at University of Chicago, is just thought leadership and doing it, because companies going backwards, they wish they knew about discount valuations before they signed the letter of intent so they could do estate planning, but they didn't. So we're trying to get ahead of the curve. And I think that's going to happen.
My final two questions before we do round robin with the audience is probably the two most common questions I get from those that are not a family member and probably not technically, obviously, in a current family office. And it still is the most common question I get from the outside looking in. Ron, what would be your advice? Let's assuming they're competent. We'll make that assumption. How does someone get a job inside a single family office?
It's a good question. Well, look, there are there's people like Linda Mack, and there's headhunters who kind of do this. But what's interesting is, what people don't fully understand is that if a family office is going to bring somebody on board or invest in a company, the first, second, third thing they want to know is, can they trust this person? And the fourth thing is, what's your track record? What's your 1, 3, 5 year track record? Right? Institutions, that's flipped. They want to know your 1, 3, 5 year track record, and then they'll do due diligence on this person. To get a job in a family office, figure out a way to add value to the family office. I had a ton. The biggest way I could add value, yes, I see a lot of great investments and we've done quite well. But the biggest value I could add to any family office is to introduce them to other family offices and get out of the way.
100%. You actually answered the number one question that I get. Angelo, how do I meet more single family offices? So I kind of say a little bit of what you just said. I'm assuming that you're competent, but let's just be honest. And I kind of try to hold their hand. The reality is you're probably a commodity. There's a small percentage of people in certain industries that are truly gifted. It's probably 1%. And that's no offense to you. You're probably competent and very good at what you do. And I know lots of talented providers dealing directly with billionaires in their family offices that aren't necessarily 1%. That's okay. So therefore, Angelo, how do I meet a single family office? You probably don't reach out to them offering your services. Could you introduce them to a family that might even be bigger and better? Now, what would be the advantage to both is families like to co-invest and meet other families, compare quote unquote best practices. But Angelo, what's in it for me? That's usually what they say. How would you answer that?
Well, I think that's a problem with a lot of people, is that they look at the world through almost a quid pro quo mindset, and I look at the world through a growth mindset. And um, I was at a conference one time, and there was a guy who was raising money for a venture capital firm, and we were at a cocktail party, and I introduced him to somebody else, and they talked, and he came back to me. He goes, "Why did you introduce me to that person? Like, what would happen?" He's like, "Well, they're not looking they're not going to invest in my fund." And My goal of that going to that conference was not to help him raise money. I just thought I'm interested in introducing two people. So I think people are very myopic right away, and they're looking to what they can get. If you give and give and give, and there's a book called The Go Giver, which I've read many times, you're going to get a lot more. And most people don't understand that, and I didn't understand that when I was young, but I do now.
That's a great answer. And, damn it, you kind of ruined one of my I want people to pay for master classes, which basically a little bit of the punchline is basically the last 2 or 3 minutes of our conversation. But as I learned a little bit from Tony Robbins, sometimes I could give you the book, you could watch my video, you're still going to have to put it into action and execute. And sometimes that is where more hand-holding actually does help. I am going to go to the audience now, Ron, so I'm able to showcase some of the questions. Could you see Cody Meltzer's question up there on screen or no?
Yes.
Let me read it for those that can't see it. Great convo. What are some ways for young entrepreneurs to align themselves? Probably a nice way of saying to get capital from family offices.
It's a great question, and I'm asked that question all the time because how do the smart people find the rich people, and how do the rich people find the smart people? I mean, so part of it's on us, on the family offices, that we have to make it known that we're out there. I mean, family offices have the right to be private, but if they want to compete with these top firms, they have to let people know what they're looking to do, that they're looking to invest in private equity, or in private equity, they only do growth stage or where they are. So they're going to have to be more public for the individual for the entrepreneur who's looking to align themselves with the family office. A lot of the family office, especially if it's a first gen family office, they were entrepreneurs. They look at things. They love young people, young talent, and they look at things through the lens of that was them just 20, 30, 40 years ago. So it's not easy, but figure out a way you can add value to a family office. Couple things, not looking for anything in return. That's my best advice to do it.
Yeah, that's great. And you know what? Sometimes you got to make the circuit. You got to get out there. And you might even, God forbid, have to spend some money. I know PitchBook is expensive, but it tells you family offices are actively investing in certain verticals and how to reach out to them. It's not cheap. But again, if you want to play in the world of a family office, sometimes you got to come prepared and you got to have the resources to do so. I may buzz through a couple of the others. Some of them are just very kind to you. Thanks for organizing this. Thank you. Oh, you have a big fan here, Ron. Thanks, Ron Diamond, for your thoughtful commentary. All good.
That was my mom's on here.
Craig Taggart, a kind of similar. Thank you, Craig. Ooh, here comes kind of a long one. Oh boy. Let's read it silently together. Then maybe I'll summarize it. It's basically a rising generation family member that's noting that parents are probably quote unquote top down and in charge. And I have a different quote unquote perspective than them. And a little bit about maybe how the rising generation could have a voice when the older generation is maybe not listening so much. What advice would you give them?
Well, you've seen it happen with impact investing. I mean, impact investing is coming from the younger generation up, not the older generation down. I mean, when I was younger and I bought a pair of jeans, I never looked at the back to see where they were made. It wasn't that I was a bad person. I had the Encyclopedia Britannica to look at. Now my kids can find out who makes the jeans, how do they treat their employees, what are their wages, and they can learn all about that. So I think they've got a lot more information. So this is the first time I think in history that my dad's generation, there's very few things he was able to learn from my generation. Our generation now can learn a ton from the younger generation because the speed of technology is happening so quickly. And with artificial intelligence, at Stanford, when I gave the professor who gave a talk right before me, he had a picture of a fire, a picture of a wheel, the word internet, and the word artificial intelligence. And he said, so in their opinion, that's how transformative artificial intelligence is going to be. So there's a lot you can learn from the younger generation, and they're much more savvy than we are in certain things, and you just have to delegate.
That's an excellent answer. Let's see the next question. Ooh, this is right up my alley, but I'm going to give you the first crack at it. Let me read it. It's short. I often see geopolitical risks cited as FO's top concern in industry reports. Where do family offices go for bespoke advice on how to navigate geopolitical environment? Let me give a pinch of context, Ron. What he's referring to is actually in three significant reports by giant banks globally. Geopolitical risk heading into 24 is the number one concern of family offices. I believe it was followed by inflation and recession. But sticking to geopolitical risk, what would be your response to that question?
It's a great question, and it's real. I mean, Trump the other day made an announcement basically saying he doesn't want to have NATO or something to that effect. He doesn't think it's that important. Uh, it when you make comments like that, it's really dangerous, right? And I think that you're in an environment right now that that people can make changes in everything. That we live in a global village, and these little changes, this war in Ukraine, it's not a war in Ukraine that doesn't impact everybody, because it's a war in Ukraine today. It could be a war in Poland next. It could be a war somewhere else. So a lot of the family office are looking at things through the lens of how is the world changing, and we really are a small world. And what happens in one country, we cannot be isolationists. We have to understand it's a global village, in my opinion.
I'm going to throw in a little bit of my opinion. I probably shouldn't. I do get in trouble when I often, and I've done 2 hour plus conversations with some of the deepest thinkers on earth on geopolitics. Go to my family office TV and other platforms. Uh, where do I even start in trying to keep it 1 minute? I do agree it should be the number one concern heading into this year. This is an election year here in the US. Look at all the challenges and problems that we have. A wicked $33 trillion plus deficit. I do not see any easy way out of that. We're still having issues with tough inflation that appear to spike a little bit, rising interest rates, which are probably due, but causing some flux of concern, especially in real estate. We absolutely have civil unrest. I could argue we bordering on having a cold civil war here in the US. We could one day have someone like AOC as president and taxing unrealized capital gains, and we have the potential, who knows what's upcoming, for lockdowns. Coupled with global war,
God forbid that happens.
coupled with two global wars, Europe in decline, but some interesting pockets, Asia on the rise, but China undergoing some massive problems, major conflict in the Middle East. We have a lot of problems. The families need, and first of all, face reality. Second of all, you need an onshore and an offshore plan. It's too simple to say have offshore trust and resources, but it's true, but you got to do it right. Most attorneys are terrible and are not doing it right. You need to have resources out of a specific country, even the US, that's more than just banking. And when I went to Europe and spent almost a month in Switzerland, in Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Austria primarily, Germany, etc., and I interviewed 1,000-year-old families, land, gold, art, and jewels, somewhat arguably with no lending, no counterparty risk, a little bit off the grid. And perhaps don't keep it all in your home or in a bank. You may want to consider the mountains of Switzerland, literally. This is something where I could do a master class, which I've done. I could tell you this is something that you probably need some hand holding on and the ability to execute. So you're talking to someone who created a 24-hour immersive masterclass over 3 days. It's not 24 hours, called Sovereign Risk and Disaster Preparedness. I have not released it yet. I did a consulting project for a couple of families with it, but I will be releasing a variation of that, probably a 4-hour version as a masterclass. As you can tell, I get a little excited about that subject. Okay, onward. Short-term strategies tend to destroy family wealth. It's more of a comment, at least from my experience. And that is Octavian. Octavian is someone that I have interviewed, comes from a substantial family, and is incredibly insightful. I agree. Ron, I'm going to give this one to you. What are the best practices in terms of identifying and interfacing with family offices, knowing that you kind of, to a degree, answered the question, but maybe summarize it for Gary?
The best way for individuals to interact with family offices?
Yeah, let's assume he's an accountant, legal, or financial services. How could he interface with them? Should he be going to conferences? Should he be a sponsor? How do they become a thought leader, a speaker, etc.?
Look, I think that it if you can add value, you can help family offices. And a lot of people think, well, how am I going to be able to help Michael Dell or Tony Pritzker or some of these big family offices? You can. It could be an introduction to another family office that they might not know. They don't know everybody, everybody's siloed. But just look at it from the lens of not trying to think about, I want to raise money from this family office. How can you give something to the family office that would benefit them without expecting something in return? It it's counterintuitive, but it works, and I can't explain why, but it just does.
I like it. Uh, Ron, I'm going to give this one to you. How do you gauge family office interest in energy transition and sustainable public equity strategies?
I'm not qualified to answer that question.
That's what I love about Ron is most people try to, and probably me too, kind of because we're good talkers, talk our way through something that we may not know too much about. Ron is and has always been, since I've known him for many years, very direct. Uh, Thank you. People giving us compliments so far. Sometimes I'll have some colorful metaphors about how I'm losing my hairline and all that, but everyone's been so kind so far. I greatly appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Interesting question. Ron, do you think most SFOs are lacking in IPS, an investment policy statement?
Yes.
And I would add, they may technically have one, but given that different branches of the family have different ages and requirements, they may need multiple. And yes, that means more work and it's harder for the single family office. Or if they have one, when was the last time you really looked at it and updated it? And if it's in today's world, more than probably a year or 18 months out, it needs work. Yes, I do agree. Ron is always bringing the good stuff, the heat. This is Octavian again. Ron, would you say that families are harnessing their family members adequately? And he's talking about internal human capital to support, quote unquote, the financial capital.
In general, no.
And I think the last one, thanks for answering my question. DC, lots of PE funds made up. Okay, I think he's kind of hinting he's in the nation's capital here in DC. Are there family offices there? Of course they are. No, it's not the number that's in greater New York, easily number one in the US, Chicago, LA, Silicon Valley, Miami, Houston, and probably others do have more. I'll agree with you than DC. If you're wondering, is public policy represented from the family side? Well, we saw that back in 2011 with Dodd-Frank and the SEC exclusion for family offices, if it fits within a certain profile. There were definitely organizations that spoke up for family offices and did a great job. I wish I could have been more active during that time in that. I was a little too much on the sidelines. That's my fault. Ron, I don't know if you have too much to add to that.
No, I look, I think that I'm a firm believer that in the soft skills, in the areas that are really important, governance, next gen succession, you're best in class. And I think that people look and they have a family office and they want to just get the top investors. You can find good investments, but it's the soft skills, the stuff you do, I think that really resonates, that will get people through. It's not hard. Intelligence is a commodity. Integrity is not. And I just think that you've created an environment where all you're trying to do is educate and create content. And that's, unfortunately, that's an exception, not a rule with most people. So
Well,
I commend what you've done.
you are very kind. I have been in the community a long time and I am very imperfect. I've made, especially early during COVID and leading up to about a year ago, a lot of mistakes and it cost me. I've been humbled. I've learned. And hopefully I'll make the right decisions moving forward. But I am confident in my competency and my capability. And when it comes to practice management and structuring and running an effective family office that becomes great, then you are getting into my wheelhouse where there's very few players in that community. There were a couple of texts that I got, and I think he meant it in a positive way, but ooh, Angelo and Ron in the same room. Is there enough? Is there enough space for both of them? Ron and I do not have an ego. We have competency, and we're willing to stretch the boundaries and say some things that might be not quite down the middle and vanilla. We should be, I think, respected for that. Are we sometimes wrong? Absolutely. But we're willing to go in public and have a conversation, respect each other's perspectives. I'm going to watch this again because Ron said some amazing things that I want to take notes on and I want to learn from. And I learned from many people. I am sometimes asked, who am I listening to lately in the community, where I purposely go out of my way? I would say Ron Diamond is basically at the top of the list. His work on investing and his thoughts and his bluntness, which I appreciate. I do like the work of Jason Ma. I haven't spoken to Jason on a more public platform like this in years. He's probably due. And in Europe, he sometimes isn't the warmest guy in the world, but from a wickedly intelligent and an incredible writer, I really do enjoy the work of Francois Beautois. Uh, I would rather, per this text, no, I'm not going to comment on who I think is, not maybe of the best. That's for you to decide. But I did point out a couple that I like. Ron, in terms of your closing comment, and maybe if you wanted to give a little bit of what you're reading, listening to, who you enjoy, what you like, I'll give the final minute or so to you.
It won't have anything to do with family office or business. It'll have to do with gratitude. I just think that we have to. I run a couple Tiger 21 groups, and the first question I ask everybody is, in the last 30 days, what's something that you're truly grateful for? And I think, myself included, we all go through life. My mom's got dementia. Everybody's got issues that constantly, but it's hard for us, the way we're wired, the way humans are wired, to really focus on gratitude. So I used to think that happy people were grateful. It's actually flipped. Grateful people in general are happy. And I think, if that into consideration, I think that's the number one message, if I can convey, much more so than, I think private equity or venture capital or real estate's a good asset class right now.
Now, Ron, I'm probably a little more self promotional than you, so I'm going to force it out of you. I'm not the only one that has a podcast that has a family office TV. There's this guy named Mr. Diamond that has one as well. How could people learn more about it and subscribe?
It's familyofficeworldpodcast.com is the name of it. And we did a great interview recently with David Rubenstein,
Mhm.
with
I
Tom
listened.
Baker. I did a really good one with Michael Leapskin. So I fortunately, because of where I sit, I'm able to get really wonderful guests. But what I do and what you do also is, there's nobody's on the podcast. Nobody's pitching anything. It's just content. It's just thought. And if you go in with that mindset, even though we're not monetizing it, it adds value, and ultimately it adds to the education. It adds to the growth of the family office community. And I think that the family office community, the biggest value that we can offer, is not in money, in making money, creating alpha. It's in philanthropy. Because you look at, like, what my dad died of prostate cancer at 57. When Michael Milken, who was my first boss, developed prostate cancer, he basically tried to solve it like a venture capital firm. So he put 2 million here, 3 million here, 4 million here. And because of Michael Milken, most men will die with, but not of, prostate cancer. And you look at what Gates did, I would argue he did more than the US government for COVID. So I don't think it's a panacea, but I think the true value of family offices is going to be in the philanthropy and the work they could do to solve a lot of real world problems.
And Ron, for those that are interested more broadly in your consultative, your services, and possibly qualifying to be a member of your Tiger groups, how can they reach out to you and learn more?
I'm fairly active on LinkedIn.
Yes, you are.
My email, it's ron@diamondwealthstrategies.com. Feel free to email me. And like I said, I'm happy to help it in any way that I can. And one of the things I remember when I was in college, I called this guy. I remember his name was, I'm going to just use his initial, Mr. M. And I was just trying to intern for the guy. And he made me feel so small, because he's like, why would you call? And all I was doing is, I was just trying to say, I'll work for you for nothing. and he made me feel so. I would never ever want to feel that way again. So I think it's incumbent upon us to really help people who are younger, and pay it forward, because that's something that we really have to do, and it does make a difference. Because I still remember how small Mr. M made me feel, and I would never do that to anybody. I think that's really really important. So I think we've been fortunate, and there's a lot we have to give back.
You're a good man, Ron, and I greatly appreciate you knowing you not only as a friend, but a colleague and someone I respect and learn from. I greatly appreciate your time. In terms of my conclusion, long overdue to have a more public +1 hour conversation with Ron. There's always so much for me to learn and certainly for all of you to learn. And Ron keeps it coming. He doesn't hold back. Again, a little bit like me, he'll say some things that will probably get us all in a little bit of trouble, that most family offices really aren't that good. We're going to get some oranges or apples thrown at us at the next family office conference that we speak at, Ron. But I think they really do need to appreciate that you're very direct with them. Again, like I said, hearing Ron at my program in Santa Monica speak about some of the things he's talking about the transition of families and their activity in directs and family capital and patient capital. He's been doing that before it became trendy about a year ago. I heard him say that, and now it's more fine-tuned and nuanced. So this has been a great pleasure. I feel like I learned so much. Again, I want to give back, and that's kind of what I do through Family Office TV. But my core initiatives are my private membership club and consultative service at SFO Continuity, and my ownership and love for teaching that I do through Family Office Masterclass. And I started to roll out, just go to angelorobles.com, a whole bunch of new upcoming masterclass programs. I've been so lucky. They've been a smashing success. I greatly appreciate all of you. And now that I'm doing some that are not 24 hours, that are more condensed to 2 to 4 hours, I think that tends to be more effective and efficient with your time and capital. So I think that's all valuable, and I appreciate all of you. Thank you for joining us today. Ron, thanks for being a great guest. Look forward to hopefully seeing you in person. It's been too long,
Could I
sooner
have,
rather than
I have
later.
one ear hug?
Yeah, let's do it. I
Always
look forward to it, Ron. My pleasure. Thank you. Bye, everyone.